Russian President Vladimir Putin has declared that peace is no longer an option in Ukraine, and that only a total Russian victory will end the conflict, effectively shutting the door on further negotiations, ceasefire, or diplomatic solutions. This declaration comes amid the confirmed entry of North Korean forces into the combat operations in Ukraine, marking a significant escalation in the two-year conflict that has already drawn extensive international involvement. Putin's statement, delivered during an emergency address to the Russian Security Council, represents the most hawkish positions taken by the Kremlin since the initial invasion in February 2022 and signals a dangerous new phase in the war. The Russian leader emphasized that any previous attempts at negotiated settlement had failed due to what he called Ukrainian intransigence and Western manipulation, asserting that military operations would now continue until Ukraine surrenders completely and accept Russia's territorial demands. This uncompromising stance has effectively shattered hopes for peaceful resolution in the near term and has raised alarm among world leaders about the potential for further escalations and regional destabilization. The involvement of North Korean forces in Ukraine represents a dramatic development in the conflict dynamics. Multiple intelligence sources confirm that North Korean personnel have begun operating in both combat support and potentially direct combat roles alongside Russian forces in eastern Ukraine. These developments appears to substantiate the mutual defense agreement signed between Russia and North Korea in June 2025, which created a formal military alliance between the two sanctioned nations. The agreement, criticized at the time by Western powers as a pariah partnership, contained vague security clause that now appears to be activated for the Ukrainian theater. North Korea's involvement reportedly include artillery units, engineering corps for fortification construction, and possibly even personnel for rear area security operations to free up Russian combat units for frontline duty. Additionally, Western intelligence agencies assess that North Korean ammunition and weapon shipments to Russia have increased dramatically in recent weeks, with shipments exceeding previous monthly totals by approximately 300%, providing crucial material support for Russia's intensified offensive operation. The international response to these developments has been swift and condemnatory. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres expressed profound concern about the escalation, warning that the involvement of additional state actors risks transforming a regional conflict into a broader international confrontation. European leaders have convened emergency meetings to discuss further sanctions against both Russia and North Korea, while China has remained conspicuously silent on the new developments, refusing to endorse either Russia's position or the Western response. The White House issued a statement through Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre describing the situation as deeply alarming and promising that the United States will respond decisively to protect global security and Ukraine's sovereignty. However, specific actions remain unclear as the Trump administration continues to emphasize its America First approach to foreign policy. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is scheduled to emergency meetings with NATO counterparts to coordinate a unified response to what officials are calling the most dangerous escalation since the beginning of the invasion. Military analysts note that North Korea's entry into the conflict could provide Russia with meaningful, though limited, additional manpower. North Korea maintains one of the world's largest standing armies, with approximately 1.3 million active personnel and nearly 600,000 reserves, though the quality of training and equipment varies significantly across units. Current intelligence assessment suggests that North Korea may commit to 50,000 personnel initially, primarily in support roles rather than frontline combat. However, experts caution that even support troops would free up Russian combat force for offensive operation. The Institute for the Study of War, a Washington-based think tank, assessed in its latest report that North Korean engineering, logistic, and artillery units could have disproportionate effects on Russian combat power by enabling sustained operation along multiple axes of advance. This assessment suggests that rather than providing a numerical wave of troops, North Korean involvement may allow Russian forces to maintain pressure across a broader front and sustain operations at a higher tempo than previously possible. Putin's declaration and North Korea's involvement come amid a renewed Russian offensive in eastern Ukraine that has made incremental but steady gains in recent weeks. Russian forces have intensified attacks along the entire front line, with particularly heavy fighting reported in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Ukrainian officials report that Russian forces have increased artillery shelling to levels not seen since early 2023, with some sectors receiving over 60,000 shells daily. The Ukrainian military has acknowledged facing significant challenges due to ammunition shortage and delayed Western military assistance. Though newly arrived American equipment under the Trump administration's conditional aid package has begun reaching frontline units, the situation remains fluid, with both sides suffering heavy casualties in what Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has described as some of the most brutal fighting of this war. The combination of increased Russian offensive operations, North Korean involvement, and Putin's rejection of diplomacy creates what analysts are calling a perfect storm that likely prolong the conflict and increase its intensity. The geopolitical implications of this escalation extends far beyond Ukraine's borders. The emerging Russia-North Korea alliance represents a significant shift in global power dynamics, creating what some analysts term an axis of authoritarian that challenges the US-led international order. This partnership provides Russia with additional military resources while offering North Korea economic benefits, technological transfers, and potentially enhanced geopolitical standing. Meanwhile, the international community remained divided in its response, with China continuing to walk a careful line between its stated neutrality and its increasingly obvious economic and diplomatic support for Russia. The European Union faced internal division over how aggressively to respond, particularly regarding energy imports that still flow from Russia to some member states. The United States, under the Trump administration, has emphasized bilateral approach over multilateral coordinations, creating uncertainty about the cohesion and effectiveness of the Western response. This fragmented international landscape appears to have emboldened Putin to take his most aggressive stance yet, calculating that the divided response will prevent meaningful counteractions. Historical context suggests that Putin's declaration represents less a sudden shift than the explicit acknowledgement of a long-standing reality. Peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine have been effectively stalled since April 2022, with minimal progress during various rounds of talks sponsored by Turkey, Israel, and other intermediaries. The Minsk agreement that previously governed the conflict in Donbas collapsed completely with a full-scale invasion, and subsequent attempts to revive diplomatic processes have foundered over fundamental disagreement about territorial sovereignty and security guarantees. Putin's statement thus formalized what has been increasingly apparent. Russia remains committed to achieving its maximalist war aims through military means rather than compromise. This acknowledgement removes the diplomatic fig leaves that has allowed some countries to position themselves as potential mediators and force all international actors to recalibrate their approach to the conflict. The explicit rejection of negotiations may actually clarify the battlefield as the sole arena where the conflict's outcome will be decided, at least in the immediate future. The humanitarian implications of this escalated phase are severe. United Nations agencies report that civilian casualties have increased by 40% in the past month alone, with particularly high numbers in urban areas subjected to intensified shelling and aerial bombardment. The already strained humanitarian aid infrastructure in Ukraine faces collapse as fighting disrupts supply routes and targeting of energy infrastructure creates widespread blackouts during the approaching winter month. International humanitarian organizations have issued urgent appeals for increased funding and access, warning that the combination of intensified combat operations and winter conditions could create a catastrophic situation for civilians in conflict-affected areas. The World Health Organization has documented attacks on 26 healthcare facilities in the past 2 weeks alone, further degrading the already stretched medical response capacity. The explicit rejection of ceasefire or humanitarian pause contained in Putin's declaration suggests that these trends will worsen significantly in coming months, creating what one aid worker described as a perfect storm of human suffering. The role of the United States in this escalated phase remains uncertain but crucial. President Trump has maintained a somewhat ambiguous stance toward the conflict, emphasizing ending American military involvement while simultaneously providing conditional aid to Ukraine. The administration's approach has focused on leveraging U.S. influence to create negotiation opportunities rather than committing to Ukraine's unconditional victory, a position that has drawn criticism from both hawks and isolationists within the American political landscape. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Secretary of Defense Peter Hegseth have taken increasingly hardline positions toward Russia in recent weeks, suggesting a possible shift in administration thinking. However, Trump's own statement have emphasized his desire to end the war quickly rather than prolong U.S. involvement, creating uncertainty about American policy direction. The recent developments likely forced the administration to reconsider its approach, as Putin's rejection of diplomacy undermines the negotiation-focused strategy that has characterized Trump's second-term Ukraine policy to date. Looking forward, military analysts suggest several potential scenarios following these developments. The most likely outcome appears to be a protracted and intensified conflict with increasingly direct involvement of external powers. Russia's renewed offensive capabilities, bolstered by North Korean support, may enable incremental territorial gains, particularly in the Donbas region where Ukrainian defense have been stretched thin. However, most analysts doubt Russia's capacity for dramatic breakthrough given the continued resilience of Ukrainian forces and the ongoing, though delayed, Western military assistance. A second scenario involves further internationalization of the conflict, with additional powers such as Belarus or Syria potentially contributing force to the Russian effort in exchange for economic or political concession. The most dangerous, though least likely scenario involves potential nuclear signaling or escalation, particularly if conventional operations stall or reverse. While most experts consider direct nuclear employment unlikely, the increasingly existential framing of the conflict by Russian leadership raises concern about potential escalation pathways that previously seemed remote. In conclusion, Putin's declaration of exclusively military resolution and North Korea entry into the conflict represents inflection points in the Ukraine war that signals more intense and prolonged fighting ahead. The explicit rejection of diplomacy removed avenues for conflict resolution that, however, faintly offered potential off-ramp from the violence. The involvement of North Korean forces internationalized the conflict further and demonstrate Russia's willingness to leverage partnership with other sanctioned states to circumvent international isolation and sustain its war effort. The international response remained fragmented, with significant divisions within Western alliance about appropriate responses and level of support for Ukraine. The humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate dramatically as civilian populations bear the brunt of intensified combat operations, and the role of the United States under the Trump administration remains uncertain as it balances desire to disengage from foreign conflicts with concerns about global stability and American credibility. What appears certain is that the conflict has entered a new and more dangerous phase that extend the suffering of the Ukrainian people and increased risk of broader international confrontation. That's all for me for today. If you like the video presentation and you would like to follow me for more, hit that subscribe and like button now, and we will continue to build this show for you. Thank you to all of you guys who have subscribed. It means a lot to me. Thank you so much. I will see you soon. Bye for now.